everyone. My name is Monica Monaco. I would like to welcome you for the session on what is next for regulation in Europe. I am a consultant based in Brussels. I am managing director and founder of Trust EU Affairs, and I have the pleasure to welcome here today Mr. Hufeld. Mr. Hufeld is the president of the German Federal Financial Supervisory Authority, known as BaFin, since March 2015, and is a board member of the Single Supervisory Mechanism, of the Global Financial Stability Board, of the Group of Governors and the Heads of Supervision, and of the Basel Committee of Banking Supervision. Mr. Hufeld, it's an honor for me to have the pleasure to interview you today. So welcome to this
It's a pleasure
session.
to be here.
Thank you. So I will start with my questions, if you permit.
Sure.
So my first question would be about international technology companies. So what we are seeing is that international technology companies are taking on a more active role in the financial services industry in various ways. For example, we see that there are partnerships with financial institutions, and notably, I could cite, I don't know, Apple plus Goldman Sachs with the Apple Card, or we see also that they're setting up own financial arms with diversified services. For example, Facebook Financial with WhatsApp Pay, Facebook Pay, Novi, Uber with Uber Money. But also we see that they are taking a strategic stake in financial technology companies through venture arms, like, for example, Google Ventures. What is, in your view, the biggest impact that the entry of companies such as this incredible scale and weight like GAFAM into the financial services industry mean for each of these parties? So what do you think this means for the banks, for example, but also what does this mean for technology startups and for consumers?
Well, indeed, the impact is huge, and needless to say, we haven't seen all of it. It's evolving very rapidly. And at the very least, I would say the biggest single impact we can see already today is a fierce battle for customers. Who is owning the interface to the customer? Who is owning the point of sale to the customer? That is obviously, next to many other things like back office optimizations, efficiency gains, process optimizations. That's all true as well. But I think the single biggest thing from a competitive dynamics point of view is certainly who owns the customer. If you are running one of the major integrated platforms and you're plugging in more and more financial services, supplementing your other core trades or e-commerce activities, you're eating your way into traditional financial services step by step. And the more you suck in traditional customer relationships from a customer-bank relation towards sort of a more platform-based relationship, it is fundamentally changing the dynamics. Now, regards startups, indeed, it's funny to see. It's a very diverse and heterogeneous landscape out there. There are the famous big techs. There are huge players out there investing billions, literally billions of dollars into innovation and development and research activities. But there are also smallish, quite smart, innovative garage-style startups. So traditionally, their biggest advantage is speed and innovation. And of course, from where I'm sitting, competition is a good thing. I welcome competition. Competition is increasing choice, increasing value for customers. And the last component of your first question was about customers. And that's indeed what it's all about at the end of the day. As soon as there is real sustainable value for customers, I think any particular new business model will prevail. Certainly, there are a lot of business models out there, a lot of startups out there, where I personally believe, that's just my personal opinion, they will not prevail. But that's perfectly okay. You know, if you have an innovative, a vivid environment of startups, it is very normal that 3 out of 5, 4 out of 5 do not succeed. But if the one remaining is the next Google or the next Amazon, we all win. You know, that's just the rules of the game. And the differentiating factor is most certainly, whatever you do, whatever you offer, are you eventually creating real value for the customer along one of the big dimensions or not?
Absolutely. Thank you very much. My second question would be about the role of BaFin and how this role can change as a supervisory body. When we look at the entities that fall under your supervision, they are changing. They are looking at things like AI. They're exploring a currency like central bank digital currencies. They are working on the blockchain. So how does BaFin change as a supervisory body in this respect? So which are the mechanisms that you can put in place to make sure that you evolve both the regulatory guidelines for the financial services industry in Germany, but also the way in which you enforce compliance? And does BaFin as an organization look at adoption of these technologies also for your own development? Is this some form of modernization of BaFin? What are some of the technologies that you think will have the biggest impact on how BaFin operates? So my question would be about BaFin and technology, both as a supervisor, but also as an entity in itself.
Yeah, your question, in fact, was at least 25 questions, I suppose. But all of them are very much on target and very good questions indeed. So let me try to sort it out a little bit, if I may. And please forgive me if it's a little bit of a longer answer, because you, in fact, asked 25 questions. So to start with, it starts with something pretty simple. You know, traditional authorities, which BaFin is, we're around for quite a while. It starts with understanding what the heck is going on out there. You need people who understand truly innovative things, who understand crypto assets, who understand cloud services, who understand blockchain. And so we have established structures to truly do research on issues like that, to contribute, as you may or may not know, very significant research reports we have published ourselves as a contribution to an international regulatory dialogue. I mean, BaFin is one of the largest regulators in the world. So we are obliged in a way to be an active contributor to such debates. So it starts with something seemingly simple, is established structures, people, know-how to understand what's going on there and try to adjust. Now, from sort of a traditional supervisory point of view, you touched upon a couple of quite tricky issues which are indeed changing. It starts with what you mentioned, established financial services companies applying new technologies, which raises new questions to us. How do we cope with an established bank doing massive outsourcing, applying artificial intelligence? So that's one set of questions. But it moves on. It goes back to the first question you asked. Many of the big tech companies, you know, have quite creative ways of cooperating with existing regulated financial service companies. So you have instead of traditional value chains, which have been traditionally quite integrated in the hands of a company which is fully licensed and fully supervised, you all of a sudden have more and more something you might call broken value chains, much more patchworky situations, where large parts of the value creation moves out of traditional regulatory space into the hands of pure technology companies, for lack of a better word. How do you cope with that? And indeed, not just to answer your question with new questions coming from my side, I am indeed of the opinion that we do have to rethink and to enlarge the traditional regulatory toolbox to enable us to approach companies which are technologies companies which are not having a banking license and do not require a banking license, but we do have to have access to them if let's just, for sake of an assumption, you know, a smallish regional bank would cooperate with Amazon Web Services or Google or something. And let's just hypothetically assume value creation is just fronted by the bank. 20% of it does the bank, 80% is done by, say, Google or something. That's, of course, a somewhat imbalanced and potentially difficult situation. So we need access as a supervisor to what the technology partner is doing behind the financial services fronting. So that's another set of questions. We are discussing that. We are elaborating on changing the toolbox, how to properly access such technology companies, and it's a very, very important change. Now, a third set of questions is, of course, business models will change. Now, certain banks will probably go out of business medium to long term because they're unsustainable. New banks or new combinations of technology companies plus certain financial services companies or payment services companies, for that matter, will emerge. So the whole landscape will change. It's not just traditional block A is replaced by a traditional block B or something. The whole structure will change. Now, and there's, of course, let's not forget about that, something you didn't ask explicitly, but it's of course embedded in such a world. The more you have a much more interconnected world with a much higher number of specialized players coming from different angles, very interconnected, the more you have to be concerned about cyber risk. You didn't address that issue explicitly, but of course it's hidden anywhere. I mean, it does happen. You shouldn't say it could happen. It is happening every single day. And we haven't seen the nuclear disaster style damage so far, but it could happen any day. And we have seen near nuclear damage type of problems in certain places in the world. So the dark side of digitalization is certainly a major, major challenge, and that includes my authority. And we have built up significant capacities to do supervision on IT security management, because, I mean, the financial services companies, leave alone technology companies, own massive amounts of data, of very intimate data of any of us, and we should be very concerned about their safety. So it's a very broad range of change, which we are indeed facing, and we have a quite active partner as a regulator and supervisor to drive things forward and to hopefully draw the right conclusions in a dialogue amongst the international regulatory community and amongst us and governments and parliaments who eventually have to enact legislation, you know, on a national or on a European level or global.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Very interesting. Let's focus for a moment on financial technology companies, as we're mentioning them, and also their business models and structures. They are indeed the centerpiece of financial services industry for years now. While there are, of course, country-specific regulatory environments, there is always the passporting issue, which allows companies to take their services across borders within the EU. So I have to ask you, in the light of the recent events with Wirecard, how do you think the regulatory environment in Europe will change, given the shortcomings of regulating one part of a business and not having enough visibility into other parts of the same business that fall into the oversight of other regulators due to the business structure? So what changes do you think need to happen in the regulatory environment of the EU to prevent similar events in the future?
Well, it comes back a little bit to the question you already asked a minute ago. Indeed, I am of the belief that the supervisory toolbox needs to be enlarged and needs to be broadened. But there are different dimensions to that question. And you touched on at least two dimensions of that. The one is, call it geographic fragmentation, which comes back to the basic liberties within the EU and passporting rights. That is, so to speak, not a new, but a very well-known path of integration where I am fundamentally optimistic. There are very few, to be honest, there are very few areas within the EU which have a higher degree of integration already today achieved than financial regulation. So in fact, we shouldn't rest, but we should be a little bit proud of what we have already achieved. I mean, financial 80–90%, that's not a scientific number, but dimensionally speaking, of financial regulation is uniquely European law and needs to be applied uniformly across the whole of the EU. So that's the geographic dimension. A second dimension, which comes closer to the Wirecard example, is the scoping of regulation as such, beyond geographic component. What I mean by that, to take PSD2, the Payment Services Directive 2 as an example. So there you have to be quite explicit, what are you regulating as a payment service provider falling under the scope of PSD2, and what do you consider to be a technology service provider which is explicitly not falling under the remit of PSD2. And then it very much depends on the political appetite you are having in calibrating various goals. And it's very often, not just in that particular case, a kind of a tension between promoting innovation here and being more stability and safety orientated there, and take identification, strong client identification requirements is a perfect other example. So if the general political mood is more on the we want to promote innovation side, you tend to scale down the scope of what really falls under the remit, because talking to people like me is completely surprisingly to me considered to be as commonly not helpful for innovation, which of course I can't understand, but that's the way it is. So if you are more concerned, and that could be a conclusion to be drawn out of the Wirecard experience, you may have to recalibrate that thin line between what falls under the scope of supervision as a payment service provider versus what's out. So that's a scoping thing. So a third thing, which we already touched upon in one of your previous questions, is more about outsourcing and broken value chains, but I think we already talked about that. So indeed, but it's not just geographic fragmentation. It would be a complete overstatement to reduce the challenges we have to cope with just on that particular aspect.
It's very interesting, and thank you very much for that. Indeed, yes, I completely agree with the PSD2 and the scope of the PSD2, and some providers were indeed left out by Article 3 precisely because of their tech provider nature. Maybe just a last question about global events and regional events and what has been taking place lately in Europe. For example, we could talk about Brexit. Do you think this is a signal of further disintegration of the regulatory environment in the EU in any way? Do you see supervisory bodies across EU nations being more or less interconnected and collaborative in the future as a result of Brexit?
Yeah, I think so. I personally, and I hope all Brexiteers will forgive me for that, I'm very sad and very frustrated about Brexit as an event. But I do believe that for EU27, it will reinvigorate a sense of communality and togetherness. And I'm not of the opinion, if that was part of your question, that it will kind of trigger an ongoing process of disenfranchising the remainder of the EU. I don't think so. So it has reminded many of us, looking at the past 3 years or so, whilst negotiating about the post-Brexit challenges, how valuable an integrated structure like the EU is for all of us, how much benefits goes along with it. Obviously, we haven't been good enough in explaining the benefits to the broader public, and then we have to live with such an unfortunate event. But I'm not at all, I'm quite optimistic about that the remainder of the EU27 will learn its lessons, will move ahead, will create a better place to live for millions and hundreds of millions of people. And let's not forget about one thing. I'm a big fan of the famous quote of the former Prime Minister of the UK, Theresa May that the UK is leaving the EU but not Europe. And I think it's in the mutual interest of both the UK and the EU to one way or the other establish new ways of cooperation, particularly in financial services. It is quite obvious that London will remain a very important financial hub by global standards, and we are all very well advised to make the best out of it. If we don't, the laughing winners will sit in places like New York, Shanghai, or other places, and certainly not in Europe. So we better get our act together and get the best out of it. So I am optimistic. Maybe that's my personal bias, but I truly believe we'll turn that eventually into a positive.
Thank you very much. So if I can take three takeaways from this interview, which was very insightful for me, I would say, first of all, there is the importance of the regulatory toolbox which evolves. So regulators should rethink the regulatory toolbox. Cyber risk and IT security management is a key aspect of this review of the regulatory toolbox. And also in terms of access to technological partners of financial services entities, there is a need indeed for regulators to have such an access, especially in the function as a supervisor. So for me, the key point in this conversation are really about how to review the regulatory toolbox and the IT component, the cyber risk component of this, and indeed the question mark about how can supervisor have access in some way to technological partners of financial services industry. So that's how I would summarize this interview. And I thank you very much, Mr. Hufeld, for your time and for your patience with us today.
Excellent. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much indeed.